before one could recognize her and said, "Let it not be known that the woman came to the threshing floor." This is the word of the Lord. My hope as we go through this sermon is that you too would also perceive God working in your life. Maybe you're going through a season right now where you're discouraged, you're asking the question, could God possibly be at work? And I want to encourage you to look at this story so that it will serve as a basis and a foundation for you in a way of affirming this truth that God is at work. In fact, that'll be our first point today. Today, we're going to look at the fact that God is at work, number one. Secondly, we're going to look at the fact that God is at work through you. Thirdly, we are going to look at the fact that God is at work despite you. And that lastly, we're going to look at his motivation for being at work in our lives. God works out of love. First, God is at work. Let's recap the story a little bit here before we dissect this reality and this point. What are we learning? We're learning the story of these two women that lived in the country of Moab, who, while living in Moab, had faced great tragedy. Naomi, the older one, had moved there 10 years prior to when this story starts. She moved there with her husband and her two sons. And while they were in Moab, her two sons got married. They found wives for themselves. And while there, not only does her husband, the patriarch of the family, dies, a man by the name of Elimelech, but so do her two sons. And now she comes back to where she should have never left with her two daughters-in-law. They are hopeless. They are in distress. There's no prospect of a future. Halfway back to the town of Bethlehem, where she came from, one of the daughters-in-law decides to return and go back to Moab to be with her family. And she ends up back in Bethlehem in the country of Judah with her only daughter-in-law, a woman by the name of Ruth, by which this book is named after. And the two of them have to restart their lives there. And the plan that they come up with is that Naomi, since she is older, she stays at home and takes care of the house, while Ruth goes out to glean from the fields and gather grain so that she could bring home food to feed herself and her mother-in-law. And it's while she's out in the fields gleaning that she ends up in a field of a man by the name of Boaz, who turns out is a distant family member of Naomi, and a distant family member, therefore, of her dead husband. And that man, when he acknowledges that truth, that Naomi is his family and so is Ruth, he takes them under his wing. He offers them protection, kindness, and provision. And I think this is an important point for us to stop in the story, because she did not end up in Boaz's field by accident, by chance. What led her to Boaz's field was God's providence. What is God's providence? God's providence is when God works through natural means to bring forth his supernatural will. So God, even though is not mentioned in the outworkings of her story, we very much know that God is the one that's orchestrating everything. Even when there is silence, the music is still playing. I don't know if you are a fan of the Beatles. How many of you here are fans of the Beatles? There's an old Beatles song. Charlie, are you a Beatles fan? Have you ever heard the song "A Day in the Life"? If you're familiar, if you're a real Beatles fan, you know this song. But this song, "A Day in the Life," is a song that has this. In the middle of the song, there's this orchestra crescendo, and after this crescendo, the song sort of dies down, and there's a 5-second pause. Now, a 5-second pause in a song is enough for anyone to fast forward, right? Or to switch to the next song. And if you don't know the song, that's exactly what you're going to do, because there's silence. But if you wait long enough, the music, the sound reappears. And in the same way that pauses are also part of music, many times when God is silent, it does not mean that he is hidden, that he is not speaking, and that he is not working. The music is still playing. God is working. We learn here in this story all things for good. I mean, he's weaving the pain of these characters and their joys with their joys, and he's also weaving their stories of sufferings to bring forth his story of salvation, both in the present so that the needs of these women are met and they're able to survive, but also his future salvation is coming forth. That's what we learn at the very end of the story, because it's through the preservation of this family that God brings forth his Savior into the world, Jesus Christ. He's a member of this family. And it lines up perfectly with that famous verse of Scripture in Romans 8:28, where the Apostle Paul writes, "And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good." Not just the good parts, but the good and the bad. God is always using our moments of laughter and our moments of tears to accomplish his will. I don't know if you saw this, but there was a piece that was printed on the local newspaper with the pictures of all of you who were baptized last Sunday. How many of you seen this? I encourage you to grab a copy of The Islander, and it's a beautiful thing. You look at all these faces, and when this came out, and I was looking at this piece here in the newspaper and the faces of everyone who was baptized, I was reminded of some of the stories. Now, I don't know all the stories that led these people to faith in Jesus, but I know some of the stories. And here's what I've learned in these stories: that God used physical pain, that God used heartaches, that God used broken relationships, that God even used a pandemic to bring these people here so that they would hear and experience the gospel and respond with faith to that which Jesus Christ has done. It's amazing. All of your stories. I can go into details, but I won't. But every single face here has an amazing story of how God worked all things for good. And the reason why you have been placed here in this day, in this time, this age, in this island, in this church, it's not out of chance. This story tells us you don't end up in Boaz's field out of chance. It's God's providence. God has brought you here. Many of you now can understand that God really has brought you here because it's been a year or 2 years or 3 years, and you see what has happened in your life. God has been at work. And I think that this should be a great source of encouragement for all of those of you who are here today, because, for those of you who are still single, you may be wondering, is God really at work in my life? Is he really preparing someone for me so that I can share my life with in the future? I see the time going by or passing me by. The clock is ticking. And I've tried getting into relationships, and one have been more horrible than the other. Is God really at work? Maybe you're here today and you have been laid off. Maybe you're here today and you quit your job because you couldn't take it any longer. And you're always asking yourself, is there an opportunity out there where I'll be able to use my passions and my gift and I will actually enjoy what I do? Does God have something special for me to do in this world? And if you're going through pain and suffering right now, if you're not necessarily going through a nice season of life, could it be that God is also working that right now for your good? What this story says is that God is at work. It reminds us of that. But also that God is at work through us. And I mean, he's at work through you. He's at work through others in your life, because ultimately the way in which God works in this world is through people. He is working in Naomi's life through the life of Ruth. He is working in Ruth's life through the life of Naomi. He is using Boaz as someone that would bless both Naomi and Ruth. God is at work, but he is at work through us as well. And this is something very important to realize, because this chapter in this story builds up a tension between the sovereignty of God, a God that is sovereign, a God that works in the world through his providence. Remember what I said about providence? Is God working through the natural circumstances to bring forth his supernatural will? God is at work. In fact, I remember this word from Jesus in the Gospel of Matthew, where Jesus, after being confronted by the Pharisees, after healing on a Sabbath, which was the day of rest, Jesus reminds them that my Father does not rest. My Father is still at work to this day. There's not one day that God ceases to work. And what we believe is that the reason why the universe is held together is because God is sovereign and he is in control. But the fact that God is sovereign and he is in control does not excuse our responsibility. Just because God is sovereign, it doesn't mean that you must sit on your hands. You know, look at the story, what's happening here. I don't know if you have read through the whole book, but there's a big pause between chapters 2 and 3. Remember in chapter 2, the first time that Ruth has an encounter and a conversation with Boaz, she's treated with kindness, with generosity, and then she expects that to follow, and then Boaz goes silent. She goes back to work. And then in verse 23, which is the last verse of chapter 2, we read, so she kept close to the young women of Boaz, because Boaz had told her, hey, I want you to stay safe, stay close to my young women because they're protected by my other guys. So she kept doing that, and she gleaned until the end of the barley and wheat harvest. So she kept working. The barley season, which was probably like a month, maybe 45 days, was over. And then the last line in chapter 2 is, and she lived with her mother-in-law. And that's it. The story stops. It's almost like the end of the story. And Boaz is now nowhere to be found. It's kind of like what you gals have felt before. You go on a date with the guy that you meet, and you felt that date went really, really well, that you guys were connecting, that you guys were finishing each other's sentences. And then the next day, there's no phone calls, there's no text messages, he's nowhere to be found, he doesn't have a social media account. And you're like, what's happening? What's going on? You're asking people. You start stalking. And I'm imagining here in this story, Ruth going back home to Naomi and says, hey, did anyone say anything about Boaz? Did anyone see him? Has he sent a message to me through you or through someone else? No, dead silent. And you know what they do? Let's come up with a plan. Two ladies. Oh, when two ladies say, let's come up with a plan. Hey, listen, it's trouble. And they do come up with a plan, and I'm going to talk about the plan in my next point, which is outlined in verses 1 through 5. So this is a cliffhanger here for you. But I'll tell you how Ruth responds to the plan that Naomi and the strategy that Naomi comes up with. Verse 5. And she replied, this is Ruth, and she replied after the plan was laid out to her, all that you say I will do. And I love that because they're trusting in God, they're resting in God, but they're taking actions too. You know, a lot of people says, hey, your next opportunity is out there. Trust that God will bring the next opportunity. And what that does not mean is that you sit on your hands, that there's an inaction there. You know, see, resting in God is a condition of the heart, that you're not anxious because you know that God has what's best for you, but that should activate your movement. If you are looking for the next opportunity in terms of work, trust that God will bring that to you, but submit your resumes. Go to the interviews. You're trusting that God is going to give you a godly man or woman. Trust that He will, but come to church and meet people after church. Join community groups. Don't go looking for someone out in the bars or Tinder or that sort of thing. Some people are laughing because I know y'all into this thing. But you take action. And that is what she is doing here. They are teaching us that motion should always trump emotions. Even when you don't feel like it, even when it's hard, even when it may seem humiliating, or that you're just spinning wheels, doing something, you do it. Not because of how you feel, but because you trust God. He is working through you too. But then thirdly, He is working despite you. He is working despite you. Now let's look at the outline of the plan that these two ladies come up with. The plan that actually Naomi is responsible for crafting. This is what she says to her. First of all, she says, I know you haven't been able to find him, but I know where he's going to be tonight. Because the harvest is over, and everyone, when the harvest is over, goes out to the threshing floor, which is the place where they would dump all the grains of the wheat, and they would tread it in order to separate the shaft from the grain. And after they do that, they're going to put everything in bags, and he for sure is going to be there, and then they're going to throw a party. And then they're going to eat and drink and dance, and he's going to be there. But here's what I want you to do. Let's look at the plan. Verse 3. She says, I know where he is. That's where he's going to be. Verse 3. Wash therefore and anoint yourself and put on your cloak and go down to the threshing floor. So she says, hey, he's used to seeing you dirty and smelly because you've been working out in the fields. At times, if you guys interacted before, he's seen your hair all over the place. This time, you're going to bathe yourself. You're going to put on some nice perfume. You're going to put on that cloak. In other words, you're going to dress to kill. And you're going to show up. And when you show up, she goes on and she says, do not make yourself known to the man until he has finished eating and drinking. Verse 3. Because you're going to show up. Don't go right at him. Don't act desperate. Let him eat and drink, because if you want to talk to a man about something important, you want to make sure his stomach is full. Some of you know that strategy well. Some of you good at that strategy too. And let him drink. Let him catch a buzz. And when he catches a buzz and he parties, he's going to obviously feel tired and he's going to go to sleep by the threshing floor where all the grain is going to be packed up with the men. And the reason why they did that was because there were thieves back then, and grain was money back in those days, and they wanted to protect their earnings, and so they're going to sleep by the grain. And when he is asleep by the grain, in the middle of the night, you're going to uncover his feet. Why uncover his feet? Because the feet are the most sensitive part of the body. When you're asleep and your feet are uncovered, you feel cold at night and you wake up, right? She didn't want him to shake him or slap his face. It's respectful, so just uncover his feet and stay by his feet so that when he wakes up, you tell him, what do you want me to do? Now, listen, I have 4 daughters, and I would never give any of my daughters this advice. You're interested in this guy? You are? Okay. Go to this party where he's going to be, dress to kill. Don't go at him right away. Let him catch a buzz. When he falls asleep on the couch, uncover him and say, what do you want me to do? That's exactly the advice here. And even though this advice is smart and strategic, it is not wise. At the very best, it's a very risky advice. And there's a lot of things that could go wrong with this type of advice. She could have been taken advantage of. She could have been kicked out. He could have been angry for uncovering her. There's so many things that could have happened. They could have slept together before being married. All sorts of things could have happened. Things that could have gone wrong, but they didn't. And I'm thinking about the motivation of Naomi for devising this plan and handing it off to Ruth. Because it's certainly not coming out of wisdom. Where is it coming from? It's coming out of anxiety. If you don't do this now, something's going to happen. It's coming out of fear. That's where I think it's happening here. It's coming out of a wrong place. How many times in life have I made decisions that were motivated by anxiety and motivated by fear, motivated by anger, desire for vengeance? It didn't start in the right place at all. And by the way, Naomi and Ruth are not alone in the Bible with situations like that. There's another story that's very famous, the story of Abraham. God had showed up to Abraham and his wife Sarah at a very old age and told them, I will give you a son one day, and I will make a great nation out of this son that I'm going to give you. And time started to pass them by, and they were asking, is God really going to fulfill his promise to us? And they could not wait any longer. And at one point, Sarah also came up with a plan, said, hey, listen, I have my maid, and she is probably fertile unlike me. Why don't you sleep with her? Maybe that's the son that God is supposed to give us. And they follow through with that plan, and it doesn't go well. It's still a problem to this day. To this day. It was a time that after Moses led the people out of Egypt, the people are in the desert and they're complaining every day, getting to Moses. And they're complaining of thirst and of the food that they don't have anymore, that they used to have in Egypt. And Moses is completely irritated. He goes up to God and he says, God, the people are thirsty. You got to help me out here. And God says, hey, I'm going to quench their thirst. Go to that rock and speak to that rock. And as you speak to the rock, I will make water flow from the rock, and it will quench the thirst of the people. And he goes out there, and what does he do? He's so irritated, he's so motivated by anger that he ends up hitting the rock. And water still comes forth anyways, but he has to face some consequences later on in life because he disobeyed God. How many times have you started things wrong and God made it right? Because even when we start wrong, even when we don't get it right, God still has a way of making it right. This is what this story is all about. There's a friend of mine, he's one of the elders at Crossbridge, and he has an amazing story. He's not from this campus, by the way. He's from one of our other campuses. But he had this girlfriend in middle school, and he spent time with her, and she got pregnant at the age of 14. And all of a sudden, her family moves out of the neighborhood. I mean, he didn't know that he had gotten her pregnant. She just wondered, where did she go? After the summer, the family didn't come back. Never heard of her again in life. Meanwhile, this girl had this baby at the age of 15 now, and she raises this boy who becomes a man whose main life's objective is to find his father. And through a conversation with someone in the family, after doing, what's the name of that website that you go through the genetics? Ancestry. He finds out that his dad is alive somewhere in Florida. And by that time, that son had already come to faith in Jesus. And my friend, as an adult, had come to faith in Jesus, had become a follower of Jesus. And the two of them are put together 40 years later. This 55-year-old man sees his son. I saw the video when they first embraced each other. They were bawling like babies. And now he is in his life, and they have a family, and I just said, bro, your Christmas list has increased a lot because the man had 4 kids. Even when you don't get it right, God can still make it right. Some of you didn't start your relationships right, but God can make it right. Some of you didn't start your businesses right, but God can make it right. There's hope for all of us. That's the point of this story here. There's hope for me. There's hope for you. And let me tell you something more. You are not powerful enough to thwart God's plans for you. As a matter of fact, no one is that powerful to thwart and destroy God's plan for your life. God can take your losses and turn into a huge success. God can take your brokenness and turn it into a healing example and story for others. That's what this text is telling us. That's why it's so encouraging, because ultimately, at the end of the day, here's what we learn: that God works out of love. And this is a love story. The book of Ruth is a love story, but it's a love story not just between a man and a woman, between Boaz and Ruth and all that they went through until their story was repaired and redeemed. But this is a story that points to the ultimate story of the Bible, that God is a loving spouse redeeming a broken bride known as the church. Where do you and I come into this story? We come into the story as the characters that are faced with misery and brokenness in life. And God comes in as Boaz, redeeming us and restoring us, as our closest kinsman redeemer. We see in Boaz a picture of Christ. We see the picture of Christ in the role that he plays exactly as the kinsman redeemer. He is God, but he is also man. He is with the Father, but he is also with us. He has the nature of God, and he has our human nature as well. He is close to us. He identifies with us. He is our priest, the one who intercedes for us. He is our advocate that stands before the Father and pleads on our behalf. He is the groom to the bride, which is the church, which we are a part of. We see Jesus in Boaz's posture as well. It's an honorable posture because He is not taking advantage of her moment of vulnerability. He is not circumventing the system. I don't know if you learned in the story and remember, because there was a kinsman redeemer that was closer in terms of generations than he was. And he says to her, hey, listen, in the morning, I know you want me to redeem you, but in the morning, there's somebody closest to me, and if he doesn't do it, I will do it for sure. He's not trying to bypass the line, cut corners. He is an honorable man. He is a man that truly loves her, and we see that in his heart for her. Here's one thing that is very clear in the story. You know, when the kinsman redeemer redeemed the family line by marrying the widow in that family, allowing that family line to continue, he also took on their business, he took on their field. What we learn here in this story is that Boaz doesn't need another field. He's already a wealthy man. But he will take the field because he found a treasure in that field, and that is Ruth. At the end of the day, his heart is not for more land, more men he would back in those days, but because he finds this treasure in the field, which reminds us of that parable that Jesus talks about in Matthew 13:44, where he compares the kingdom of heaven to a treasure hidden in the field, which a man found and covered up. Then in his joy, he goes and sells all that he has and buys that field. Every time that Jesus tells a parable, he always puts himself in that parable. And I believe that the reason why Jesus told this parable is connected to the fact that this story was a well-known story by the time that Jesus came around. And he's saying this, hey, listen, I have come down to earth to redeem you, not because I need more for myself, but because I want you for me. You are the treasure in the field that Jesus was willing to give up everything. He gave up everything so that in the end of the day, he could have you and I, just like Boaz did to Ruth in this story. And so if you're questioning here today, could God be at work in my life? I want to remind you that yes, he's at work in your life. Absolutely, he's at work in your life. And then when you ask the second question, why would he be interested in working in my life or through me, despite my mistakes? Because he loves you. He was willing to give up everything, including his life, for your sake. And in the moments that you go through in life, and sometimes you don't see God at work, never say, he has abandoned me, he has forsaken me, because how can you look at the cross and say that God has abandoned and forsaken you in his hardest moment in time? He did not forsake you. He forsook himself. He's lost his life so that you could have his. One thing that none of us is allowed ever to say when we look at the cross is, God doesn't love me. How can you look at the cross and say, he doesn't love me? There's no basis for that. And this is the moment that I want to share with you. That God wants to open your eyes. He wants you to see him at work right now in your life, bringing all things for good. Because it's true, it really is true, that he loves you. You pray with me?